I want to provide just a moment of background on why I chose this project. I assisted in a feedlot following a tornado, and I've also worked a tuberculosis herd depopulation effort. And then for numerous years, the Kansas Department of Agriculture Division of Animal Health has hosted foreign animal disease exercises. And each of these situations has provided, in my mind, a need that we needed to research. I worked a Feedlot Tornado aftermath. The tornado came through one evening, and that evening and the next morning, we organized 3 euthanasia teams, and between the 3 teams, we dispatched approximately 400 heads. You can see from this photograph that some animals were down and unable to rise, and they were actually the easy ones to deal with. You can also see that we had fences that were no longer containing cattle. So we would have 3 pens of livestock that now are moving from one pen to the second to the third. We had no way to restrain those animals, and so with 2 or 3 of us in a pen, we would attempt to isolate that particular animal that needed to be euthanized, and we would accomplish that. There would be a skid steer that would come into the pen we had just left, or possibly even into the pen in which we were working, pick up the carcass, move it over the feed bunk and into the feed alley, where a loader would come by, pick those up, and move them to an in-dump semi-trailer. One of the challenges for us was the fact that there was no restraint or way to sort the animals. Human fatigue became a factor, and prompt disposal was one of the positives to this. The rendering company notified all of the surrounding feedlots that they would not run their normal route that day, and they would only pick up from this particular feedlot. So they were able to dispose of the carcasses as quickly as we euthanized them. And that often becomes a limiting factor in an emergency situation. I also worked with tuberculosis herd depopulation, and it was also a manual chute similar to the one in this photograph. What you find with a chute, whether it's manual or hydraulic, is the fact that they are designed so that cattle move themselves out of the chute, either through a front or a side discharge. When you euthanize the animal in the chute, then you must remove the carcass from the chute, and that creates human safety issues and drastically slows the process. Each year in December, in fact the week before Christmas, the Kansas Department of Agriculture Division of Animal Health hosts an incident management team exercise. For several different years, I had the opportunity to work within the Euthanasia and Disposal Branch, and several years, our theory was that we would inject the beef in an affected feedlot with Xylazine and allow them to ambulate themselves out of the chute where they would be euthanized. But we didn't have a way to actually prove that this would work. So I felt like this step needed to be accomplished. You'll find that in several states there are large animal numbers in a concentrated area. And again, feedlot chutes release the animals forward. A complication at many feedlots is the fact that these chutes are placed in a building or at least underneath cover. And due to space constrictions, there's really not adequate space for a skid steer to operate and remove that carcass. We often found when we visited with the feedlots that there's also a personnel constraint. Often feedlot personnel will be willing to bring animals to the back of a processing facility, but they won't move them farther than that forward because they recognize that these animals are being brought in for euthanasia and not normal routine processing. The previous slide and this one and the next two are all courtesy of Division of Animal Health, KDA, and I do appreciate their assistance. This is an example of Kansas from 2016, the Kansas cattle in feedlots at any one day. Kansas has in excess of 4 million, and there are several other states who also have the same type of problem that they might face. In Kansas, you can see, based upon the circles and the size of the circles, the demographics of these animals. And if you concentrate on just southwest Kansas, you'll see that these circles quickly overlap, where 2.6 million animals are on feed. Those of us who went through veterinary school probably saw Chapter 9 of Equine Veterinary Medicine. And that's what we find if we have a foreign animal disease outbreak in a cattle feedlot. We may require mass euthanasia, and there are numerous challenges associated with it. Euthanasia, defined, is good death. It's not easy. It's a difficult topic to discuss and address in real-life situations. So you want to make sure that you use an AVMA-approved method. With cattle, you can use barbiturates, which have a smooth transition. They're costly. They're not always readily available. A DEA license is required, which entails record keeping and also technical experience in administration. Gunshots or firearms are available. They have safety disadvantages. You need some anatomical knowledge, and you need the animal to be restrained in order to aim properly. Captive bolt is safe, but again, you may need another method. You again need anatomical knowledge, and again, the animal must be restrained in some method. Reality is that either gunshot or captive bolt would probably be utilized first in a mass euthanasia situation. So you need some form of restraint. You need to know the type of firearm that you're going to use and how close you need to be. So a handgun, you can be very close. Shotguns, you can be a couple of meters away. Rifles, long range. All of those might be important in the step that follows sedation. I applied for this grant in the fall of 2019, and simultaneously Hanthorne and Sanderson were doing a real-life situation in Kansas. There were 43 feedlot cattle that had exposure to lead. They were not suitable for rendering. They were not suitable for eventual harvest. Those calves all weighed approximately 600 pounds. They were sedated with xylazine, then released for them to become recumbent within an alley, and they were dispatched with a 12-gauge shotgun. They gave a dosage of 5 mils per animal. The calves became recumbent about 10 minutes post-injection. Sedation was 100%, and they had no response to the gunshots. Once they became recumbent, multiple animals could be euthanized without problem. The total time from the time they gave the first injection until the last one was euthanized was 46 minutes. Pretty efficient, 1 per minute on average, and it is a published paper. So that leads me to my Grassroots grant project. I wanted to make sure that xylazine was efficacious for this. It could be used prior to a mass depopulation. I wanted the animals to be able to ambulate themselves away from the chute, and I wanted to have an idea what the minimal dose would be, because there are limits in how much xylazine you can find on any one given day. Xylazine is a known small dose, potent, effective sedative in cattle, and you can see this calf on the right is totally resting. All of the animals used in this study were harvested. At the first location, I tried this on only 7 animals. I had limited funds, and I knew that if I over-sedated something and we were not able to recover the animal, my funding would go very, very quickly. The concentration of xylazine that I used was 100 milligrams per mil. So we injected the animal. We injected approximately 1 every 30 to 45 seconds. We released them into an alley or a pen. We limited the number per pen to either 10 to 15. Our idea was to limit it to 10, but the feedlots were very, very good to allow me to utilize their animals. I utilized animals that were already going through the chute for some other process, and we just added an injection. We know that euthanasia would be the next step. We know that disposal would also be needed, but we just wanted to prove one step in the process. I did fail to mention, at the first location where we sedated 7, we were in a rural setting, and so the owner did go and get a firearm, and we shot into the ground numerous times, and the animals did not respond to the gunshot. And I think that's important. If you're in a situation, you want to know that the animals are not going to be agitated. So in this case, this is the second operation. Instead of using an actual firearm and dispatching it, we got a paintball gun. And actually, you can see here where a paintball gun was shot on this animal. No animals were harmed in this study, but it was effective. So I did go to 3 different feedlots. Do remember that March, April, and July of 2020 was during the pandemic, so we were limited on the number of people who could be present at any one time. The cattle came to the squeeze chute brought by the feedlot personnel. We weighed the animals and recorded the tag number or individual identification of each one of those animals. The animals were injected with Xylazine, 100 milligram per mil. The volume ranged from 1 mil to 2.75 mils. On the first location, which actually had the lightest weight cattle, we started with 2.75 mils, realizing that this was less than what was recommended, but also knowing that we needed to be able to stretch Xylazine as far as possible in an emergency situation. So we only had the one lightweight animal at 2.75 mils, and everyone else received a lesser dose than that. We released the cattle to a pen or alley, and we recorded the time that they became sternally recumbent. The sedation was subjectively scored, and there's some variation in that, just that human beings score things differently. We had 68 total test subjects. We broke them based upon their weight, under 700 pounds, 701 to 1,000 pounds, and 1,001 pounds and over. Our sedation scores, if they scored a 0, they were resistant to recumbency, and we classified them as inadequately sedated. If they became recumbent for less than 5 minutes, we also scored them as inadequate. Category 2, we called light. They did lay down for more than 5 minutes. They were aware when you approached. They might have risen upon approach, and they did not return to recumbency. Categories 3 and 4 we called adequate. They went down for more than 5 minutes. They may or may not have been aware when you approached, but they remained recumbent, or if they rose, they shortly returned to recumbency. I think this is very important to remember, because it is important to know if once you get to the sedation stage and then the euthanasia stage, you are going to need personnel with skill set working with animals. If you have someone with very limited exposure to cattle, euthanasia is going to be more difficult for them. Our lightweight cattle all were adequately sedated, and it did not matter even if we gave them only 1 mil. It was adequate sedation for anything under 700 pounds. Our medium weight cattle, those from 701 to 1,000 pounds, we had 1 animal that received 1.5 mils that was light sedation. When we got to the heavyweight cattle, we had 11 of them that were inadequately sedate. And, we had 13. 11 of them received only 1 mil. 1 received 1.5 mils, and 1 received 2 mils. The one that was a heavyweight that received 2 mils and was inadequately restrained never laid down. It was a calf that was high-strung when he came into the chute and back in the crowding circle. And when he came out, he was always very aware of us. He never became sedate. So the percent of cattle that were adequately sedated by volume, 1 mil, all of the lightweight cattle, and none of the heavyweight cattle were adequately restrained. There were 9% of them who were lightly sedated. If you had experienced personnel running the firearms, those 9 or 10% would not have been a problem. And if you had the Longnetters that we had in California during Newcastle disease, any of the animals that we dealt with would have been easily euthanized by those Longnetters. So by dose group, and the dose is based upon milligrams per kilogram there to the left. I think this is a very nice visual. Anyone who's experienced running firearms could easily do anything in green and probably yellow, and you might need a far more experienced person to handle the cattle that are signified there with the red bars. This shows the time to sternal recumbency. If you would allow those animals to be unmolested for 15 minutes, you will have the great majority of the animals in recumbency. If you go out amongst them, they are slower to lay down. And again, it is dose dependent. So the dosage options, Drs. Hanthorne and Sanderson used 5 milligrams per animal or 1.84 milligrams per kilogram. Out of a 50 ml bottle, they could do approximately 10 head of 600 pounders. In this grassroots project, we wanted to see how many animals we could do with a lower dose. So our dosage was 0.194 milligrams per kilogram to 1.058 milligrams per kilogram, remembering that we had only one animal at that high dosage. That would allow you to use a 50 ml bottle for somewhere between 20 and 50 head of cattle, dependent upon the weight of those animals. And our recommendation is 0.4 milligrams per kilogram. That would be 1 mil per 500 pounder or 2 mils per 1,000 pound animal. So the Kansas Department of Ag, Division of Animal Health, and their IMT scenarios, numerous times on the phone call or in person, they have told us that the feedlot manager has told us that the personnel would bring cattle to the back of the processing facility, but they will not bring them through either the circle or bud box, snake, whatever approaches the chute. So it will be key in an emergency personnel to have skilled personnel at the alley and the chute. In addition to the euthanasia personnel, the skid steers, loader operators, and the disposal. And we recognize that all of those are additional steps in the process. These animals were able to ambulate on their own from the chute out into a pen. We did use a low dose for sedation. I would recommend that you not put more than 10 or 15 into a pen. You can see how these chose to congregate in one area. And you do need to have multiple forms of firearms available. You are not going to be able to walk up to every animal at a 0.4 milligram per kilogram dose. So you may need something more than a handgun or a captive bolt. You may need a shotgun or a rifle in order to make euthanasia occur. And also, if you will read Hanthorne and Sanderson, they tell you that firearms will get warm if they're used too frequently. So some of the limitations of this study is the fact that it was low power. We only sedated 68 head. It would be really nice to replicate this, and we did have some outliers who are reluctant to recumbency. Our drug dosages were chosen for maximum numbers. Just out of curiosity, I did contact a distributor yesterday. If we would order all of the Xylazine, both name brand and generic, available from that particular supplier across the entire United States, yesterday we could have ordered 1,000 bottles. If you'll remember back to the slide where we could get somewhere between 20 and 50 heads sedated, depending upon the weight of those animals, those 1,000 bottles would equate roughly to 37,000 animals that you could sedate for further euthanasia. maximum would be 50,000 head. And so that will become a limiting factor, that may become a limiting factor for us. The time to sternal recumbency was not measured in all cattle simply because we were running the cattle through a chute with other processing. At one location, I was the only person present for this exercise, and at 30 seconds apiece, in under 10 minutes, we had cattle already out in 2 pens, and several of the cattle had laid down. So our time to sternal recumbency is probably greater than it actually was. Dr. Brad Christensen assisted me by giving a sedation dose by body weight to effect chart. I'm sharing this only for generic purposes. It has been extrapolated from a limited number of cattle and subjective observation, but it might be helpful to someone in a future situation. So our conclusion is 2 mils of xylazine causes adequate sedation in most cattle from all weight classes. 1.5 mils would probably be sufficient for for all medium and lightweight cattle, and might provide adequate or light sedation in those heavyweight cattle. I would like to thank the Kansas Department of Agriculture Division of Animal Health, because if they hadn't hosted these IMT scenarios every December, the week before Christmas, I probably would not have been aware of how large of an issue this could be. Rachel Chaw, DVM, MPH, was working on her MPH, and this was part of her field experience. I also want to express huge thanks to the 3 cooperating feedlots and the 2020 VS Grassroots Liaison Committee and Mary Stevens. She was my point of contact, but without the microgrant, this study, again, would not have been possible. If there's any questions, Marvin, I'd be glad to take those at this time. And for those who would like to do more reading, here are the sources.
Okay, and as a reminder, you may submit questions over the chat by selecting all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, entering your question in the message box provided, and hitting send. So we do have a few questions here. In the Feedlot Tornado event, were the animals euthanized with a firearm or a captive bolt gun?
They were euthanized with a firearm.
Okay. The next question, I believe, pertains to slide 13. 5 milliliters per animal, IM or IV?
IM. Both in Sanderson, Hanthorne, or Hanthorne, Sanderson, and my own situation, they were IM.
Okay. Next, approximately how far did they walk between the chute where they were injected and the pen?
So the first feedlot, they walked approximately 150 yards. After that, they walked, the second situation, they only had to exit the chute and go maybe 20 yards. The third situation, we separated them into smaller groups. It was a feedlot that had pens off of an alley at a slant. That's really nice. They walked, the farthest ones maybe walked 40 yards, but they were capable of walking farther.
Okay, our next question is, what is the shelf life of xylazine?
I will have to do some research on that. I do not know the average shelf life of xylazine, and of course, I don't know.
Okay. Would you consider trying with IV dose since it could extend the number of doses per bottle?
That is a possibility. I think you also have to recognize that increases the skill level. It is fairly easy to inject at 1 per 30 seconds in a chute with an IM injection, and not everyone is going to have the skill set to do that in 30 seconds per head. What we've found in the KDA Division of Animal Health exercises is you need to euthanize a large number of animals in a pretty prompt time to help prevent the spread. So an IV dose is a possibility. It would extend the number dosed per bottle. It would decrease the speed. And I certainly appreciate Elizabeth telling all of us the xylazine shelf life is usually 3 years.
Okay,
so,
we do have another.
Yes.
Oh, please go ahead.
Okay, so Drew has asked, were there any discharge of firearms? Yes, we did discharge firearms at location 1 and 2, and at 2 we also used the paintball guns.
Okay, so there's another question here. Please address the withdrawal of xylazine in animals for consumption.
You have a 4-day withdrawal, and all of these animals were on feed for more than 4 days following this project, so that was not an issue for us.
Next, would the presence of xylazine in a carcass affect its eligibility for rendering as a disposal method?
I believe it would affect it for rendering. If you have a foot and mouth disease outbreak or some other disease outbreak, you probably want to keep those carcasses on site if at all possible. So while it would affect rendering, you could probably still compost on site or bury or do some other form. And for Lori's question, Lori's question is, did we use a multi-dose syringe? We did not use a multi-dose syringe. We used disposable needles and syringes, separate ones for each animal. In a euthanasia situation, a multi-dose syringe would definitely be advantageous.
Okay, once again, if you do have any questions, please make sure to submit them in the chat by selecting all panelists and hitting send. We do have another question here. How many of the cattle in your study do you think could have been euthanized with a captive bolt gun?
Give me just 1 second. All of the animals that were adequately sedated could probably have been euthanized with a captive bolt gun. And I believe that was 46. Those were all animals that were recumbent for more than 5 minutes. And you'll note recumbency was anything that was sternal or lateral. The calf under my laser pointer is obviously in sternal recumbency. The red calf was in lateral recumbency and stayed that way long enough that we were concerned about bloat, and we actually had to get that calf to become sternal.
Okay. Our next question is, would you pipe after captive bolt to ensure euthanasia?
Absolutely. With captive bolts, you need to ensure that they are, there has to be a secondary method. That's, yes.
Can you go over suggestions on extrapolating this to swine?
No, I can't. I have extremely limited experience with xylazine in swine at this, so might be good for another study.
Okay, we're currently awaiting any additional questions. And I'm seeing no incoming questions at this time. Oh, we do have another here. Just a moment. Do you think that the animals kicking out of after a captive bolt blow would stir up the animals around them and cause them to get up again? Or was the sedation adequate to keep them all down and calm?
So the animals that received the 0.4 milligram or more, 0.4 milligrams per kilogram, were so sedate that you would have been able to use a firearm if not a captive bolt. I'm not 100% certain that you could use captive bolts on all of the animals in the study. It would have been extremely challenging to use only a captive bolt. Firearms would not have been a problem, and I do not believe that the kicking out would be a problem. Even if an animal rose, those that were adequately scored would go and lay down in another area. So I don't think that would have been a problem, and there was not any ballistics data considered.
Okay, and then after that, I've used xylazine in a dart gun delivery to pull porcupine quills from a cow in a range situation. The recovery time was about 4 hours.
So interestingly enough, we did these during the day, and I did have one feedlot manager call me. The animals were not returned to their home pen until they were ambulatory and did not appear to be sedated anymore. And at least one feedlot did not return those animals to their home pen until the next day, because even at these low doses, there were effects of sedation for hours, up to 12 hours.
And if you have any further questions, remember to submit them through the chat to all panelists and make sure that you hit send.
Marvin, I did receive a private message from one of the Longnetters who was present out in California, and I would just like to appreciate what they did out there and know that if we get into one of these situations with cattle or swine, we're probably going to call upon our friends in Wildlife Services again.
Okay. We have another question here. Can you comment on safety precautions taken?
I'm not sure exactly to what she's referring. The two of us who were involved are beef quality assurance certified, but I'm not sure what she's asking.
Okay, please feel free to clarify through the chat. The next question is, for less sedated animals, would it have been possible to halter these animals and use a captive bolt on them, or would they have been refractory to stimulated by the level of handling?
I think the less sedated animals you're going to have to use a firearm on, or you're going to have to get them up and attempt to get them back through the alleyway. And while they weren't necessarily sedate enough to stay down while you walked up to them with a captive bolt, I'm not 100% positive that you would get them through a processing facility without them laying down.
Can you explain what a Longnetter is?
We had unrestrained poultry in California, and they were still required to be euthanized, and we had personnel on staff who did that. And they were in general from Wildlife Services, and if Dr. Melkai will email me privately, I'll be glad to discuss it with her. And the IM injection was in an approved BQA site. We actually put them up on the neck.
And we're currently awaiting any additional questions. Would you expect that dairy cattle would be effectively sedated with similar doses?
So that was one of the reasons I went to 3 different feedlots. I was hoping to get a variation in the animals. All 3 of them ended up having only beef breeds available on the day I was there. I would expect the dairy breed to respond somewhat similar. I don't know if there'd be a little bit difference in dosage or not. Again, it might be an area to explore with another project. In general, though, when you go to a bottle of medicine of any sort, it rarely differentiates between dairy and beef breeds.
Can you tell us again what the highest animal weight was in this study?
Give me just 1 second and I'll go to my spreadsheet. Our heaviest animal weighed 1,158 pounds.
Okay, I'm currently seeing no additional incoming questions.
Marvin, thank you so much. You've been an excellent producer.
You're welcome. Did you want to go ahead and wrap things up, LewAnn?
I don't see any other questions. Maybe one has just popped up.
Okay. How would this work interfaced with a true attempt at a depopulation event?
And I don't know if that individual was present for the entire conversation or not. There was an actual situation in Kansas, and it's published in the AABP, and it may have been published other places since then. Doctors Hanthorne and Sanderson actually had this situation in 2019, where they euthanized 43 head of feedlot cattle in Kansas, and they were able to do it in 46 minutes. They injected them with Xylazine and then utilized a firearm for euthanasia. And these were animals that were not suitable for rendering or for human harvest.
Okay, it looks like that might have been our last question there.
Marvin, once again, thank you, and thank you to all the participants who are present today. Appreciated the opportunity to do this study provided by the Grassroots Committee, and also for you for hosting. Thank you. Thank you.